In the last Koine Corner, we looked at an infinitive with two accusatives, and we talked about how one of the accusatives had to be the subject of the infinitive and the other had to be the object. Today we're going to look at kind of a variation on that theme, and it's in Acts chapter 18, and Paul is at Corinth, and he's engaged in a preaching ministry when Silas and Timothy arrive to join him. And so let's read about the nature of that preaching ministry in verse 5. The ESV says, "When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus." Now the New Revised Standard Version says it this way. "When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with proclaiming the word, testifying to the Jews that the Messiah was Jesus." So the NRSV interprets the term Christ, anointed one, and sort of translates it to Messiah. But both words mean the same thing in this context. But most translations do not follow the pattern of the ESV and the NRSV. Let's look at three others. The King James puts it this way, "And when Silas and Timotheus were come from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus was Christ." Next up, the NIV, the New International. "When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah." And finally, the New American Standard Bible, "But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ." So the first two that we looked at had the Christ was Jesus, or the Messiah was Jesus. Now these three that we've seen have Jesus was Christ, Jesus was the Messiah, or Jesus was the Christ. Let's look at the phrase in question in Koine and come to some conclusions. Enai ton Christon Jesun. So enai is an infinitive from eimi, and it means to be. So you'll notice below in the English, so second line is the transliteration. Then in the English translation, I've just directly put the meaning of the words. Enai is to be, ton is the, Christon is Christ, Jesun is Jesus. Ton Christon and Jesun are in the accusative case because they are modifying this infinitive. And just like we talked about in the most recent Koine Corner, with the infinitive here, one is going to be the subject and the other one is going to be not the object in this case, but the predicate. This is like a predicate nominative, except there are no nominatives here. These are accusatives. And the equative verb, enai, is going to be sort of the equal sign. So this either says the Christ is Jesus or Jesus is the Christ. And our task is to decide which is which. So in favor of Jesus is the Christ, which is the majority position of translations, we would think that Jesus is a proper name and the Christ is a title. And generally speaking, we would think that the proper name is the subject in a subject predicate construction. So that is a kind of a logical leap to say Jesus is the Christ would be the favored translation because Jesus is the subject. The problem with that is when we're dealing with predicates nominative at least, if one of them has the article and the other one doesn't, like is the case here, ton Christon has the article, the Christ, and the other one, Jesun, doesn't have the article, the one with the article is usually accepted to be the subject. So that undermines that notion. There's a non-grammatical argument to be made that has to do with the translators two factors about the translators who favor Jesus was the Christ or Jesus is the Christ. So if you are an English speaker, you would assume, like I was just referencing, that the personal name would be the subject and that the title would be the object. That would be how we construct things in English. Jesus is the Christ or Jesus was the Christ. It would be, we would say Roger Goodell is the commissioner of the National Football League. We wouldn't say the commissioner of the National Football League is Roger Goodell. More likely we would start with the person rather than the title. The other part that factors into this is all the translators in question are Christians, and they have a particular and personal allegiance to the person of Jesus. So for them to look at this, enai ton Christon Iesun, and for them to prioritize Jesus is a part of their philosophical bent. And I don't mean that in any critical way, but if you're a Christian, the person who is Jesus Christ is where your allegiance lies. You're probably going to lean in that direction. Jesus is the Christ versus the Christ is Jesus. Now, let's move on. In favor of the Christ is Jesus, we have the word order, right? Ton Christon comes before Iesun in the construction. We have the article being attached to Christon rather than Iesun. Normally, you wouldn't split, if you were going to split the article from the noun it's modifying, it would be split with an adjective, not another noun. So, ton Christon, the Christ, Iesun, Jesus. If it was an adjective, because it's a title, it's not an adjective. He's not someone who does Christy kind of things. The Christ is Jesus are two nouns equated by enai, the stative verb. So that's another reason why we wouldn't. And frequently we see in predicates nominative that the predicate precedes the subject. And we have that in this case. We don't have that in this case if we're going to translate it, the Christ is Jesus. Finally, what I think is the best argument in favor of the Christ is Jesus is what we're told in the verse about Paul's ministry. What was he doing? He was testifying to the Jews. That's what immediately precedes our phrase. He was testifying to the Jews. These are Jewish people in Corinth, and Paul is reaching out to them, trying to tell them something critically important. And what is it that the Jews in Corinth and everywhere else have been waiting for? They've not been waiting for a guy named Jesus. They've been waiting for the Messiah, the Christ. That's what they've been waiting for. All their prophetic history points forward to a son of David, a Davidic king who would reestablish the kingdom on earth, who would vanquish their enemies, who would put them in the rightful position of the chosen, etc., etc., etc. And they're waiting not for a guy named Jesus, not for a carpenter's son from Nazareth. They're waiting for the Messiah, the Christ. So it makes sense that the nature of Paul's preaching would be to communicate to them that the Christ, the one for whom you have been waiting for generations, is in fact Jesus, who was born in Nazareth to Mary and Joseph, and who grew up and performed these miracles and developed this following and was predicted by these prophets, etc., etc. His ministry in the Word is not to say there's a guy named Jesus who you should think about as possibly being the Christ, but saying the Christ for whom you have been waiting is in fact Jesus. For that reason, I suspect that the word order supports the notion that the better translation of enai ton Christon Iesun is the Christ is Jesus rather than Jesus is the Christ. Because the point that Paul is trying to make is the Christ for whom you have been waiting is in fact this guy Jesus. And let me tell you why. But just like in the last episode of Koine Corner, I wouldn't fight you over it. I wouldn't arm wrestle you over it. I wouldn't flip a coin over it, because it's possible that you could go either way. Why do the majority go Jesus is the Christ? Again, I think the bias is that they're Christians and that their primary language is English. And in English, you would prioritize the person rather than the title. But we're not working in English, we're working in Koine Greek. Enai, to be, ton Christon, the Christ, Jesun, Jesus, the Christ is Jesus. Great stuff. Hope it was good for you. If it was, like, share, subscribe, leave me some feedback in the comments. And until next time, Charis Kai Irene Humin, grace and peace to you.